Hi guys, this is Orlando Morgado, Sculpture Shop Supervisor, and today I'm going to show you guys how to use plaster. So, first thing to keep in mind is that if you're working at home, plaster is extremely messy. So you have to be careful about getting it all over yourself, all over your work area. Here in the sculpture shop, we have these boards and we work on top of the boards so that we can transfer our work around. It can be somewhat mobile and we can kind of contain our mess. At home, you're probably going to want to use plastic sheeting. Depending on your kit, you probably will be getting plaster or plastic sheeting with your kit when it gets home to you. So we're going to look at a couple of different things to do with plaster. We're going to show you how to just do a basic plaster mix for casting purposes, and we're going to show you how to use plaster gauze to make a rigid shell over an object. So first thing we're going to do is we're just going to talk about what plaster is. So here's a box of plaster. This is what you guys are going to be getting. I'm going to use an X-Acto blade here. Be careful when you're cutting with these so that you don't cut yourself. And what you guys are going to get is going to be a bag of plaster like this. Now, there's some instructions in here, disregard. This is what you're going to get. This is 5 pounds of plaster. This is not a lot of plaster. So when you are experimenting with this stuff just to try it out and see what it does, work in small batches. So plaster is basically a powder and you add water to it and it reacts to the water and it solidifies. So there's a couple of things you have to worry about safety-wise when it comes to this stuff. Number one, it's not something you want to breathe. In small quantities, it's not going to hurt you. It's basically just an irritant. It's not really any worse than a nuisance like sawdust or something like that. You can use a nuisance dust mask if you find it particularly irritating. But generally speaking, you should be fine. But there's ways you can keep the dust down. So for example, if you're scooping out some of it, you don't want to scoop it out and then drop it from a great height because then it's going to make a big splash. You know, move it around, you know, in a way that you're not creating large clouds of dust. Another problem with plaster is that when you're using plaster, it reacts to water through an exothermic reaction, and that means that part of the way that you know that it is working is that the plaster heats up. That exothermic reaction can actually cause burns. So you should never, ever, ever cast a part of your body inside a bucket of plaster. So you're not going to take a bucket and fill it with plaster and water and then stick your hand in it, stick your face in it, your foot, etc. Because when that plaster heats up, it will burn you, and also it will lock whatever is in there mechanically in place, because when it hardens completely rigid. So that's something else to keep in mind. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix a small batch so that you can see what that's like and kind of the volume. Now, if you were working in the sculpture shop, we would be using large buckets and we would be scooping this stuff up by hand and putting it into a bucket, mixing, etc. What we're going to do today is we are going to use buckets and cups just to conserve material. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add water to our bucket, and then we're going to add plaster to the water, which is always how you want to do it. So follow me to the sink. When you get your water, a couple of things to keep in mind, especially if you're working in a home environment. You never ever want to dump wet plaster down the sink because it will solidify in the pipes and destroy your pipes and your sink. So if you have made too much plaster, which should not be a problem since you guys have small quantities, but if you have excess wet plaster that you need to dispose of, let it harden in the container where it is currently sitting, and once it's hardened, just throw it in the regular trash. Never dump it down the sink wet. Now, when it comes to plaster and water, water temperature is going to have a big effect on the speed of the cure. So as plaster starts to harden, it goes through a curing process, and that's also when it goes through its endothermic reaction. The hotter the water, the faster the plaster is going to harden. So depending on what you're doing, you can play with that water temperature to either get the plaster to harden more quickly or more slowly. So for our case, we're just doing a demo piece. I'm fine with the water being warm. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna turn on the hot water. And I'm gonna get some hot. Ideally, you wanna work with maybe room temperature. Room temperature water is kind of ideal, or slightly warmer. So this is a little warmer than room temp, which is fine for a demo. I'm gonna bring this over here. And I'm gonna take a spare cup and I'm gonna start scooping. And I'm just gonna take a little scoop at a time and I'm going to gently sprinkle it into the water. And I'm gonna add some more. And again, I'm gonna gently sprinkle it because I'm trying to keep the dust down. I'm also gonna gently sprinkle it because this is a way of sifting the plaster. Another way to do it is to use your hand, scoop it out, and sift it by hand. You'll be able to feel any lumps that are in it and get them out. So I'm gonna take something to mix. It can be a spare spatula. In this case, I found some tongue depressors. It can be things like chopsticks if you have any laying around. And then you start to mix. Now right now, when I put this in there and I pull it out, it's white, but it's still not fully opaque. You can kind of see the color of the wood through it. So I'm gonna keep adding. And you're gonna notice that at a certain point, the plaster just kind of starts to sit on the surface of the water. And I'm gonna mix kind of gently. I don't wanna aerate too much. We're getting more opacity. If you stick your hand in it and you pull it up, it should be completely opaque. So that's pretty solid right there. So that was about a quarter of a bucket's worth of water and then 3 or 4 scoops in these little Dixie cups. So I'm gonna mix that up, and let's say I wanted to carve with this. I could just take this, let it harden in here, and then later I can remove it from the bucket and carve it. But right now, because I just mixed it quickly, what's gonna happen here is that there's gonna be a lot of bubbles in it. So I'm gonna hold the bucket and I'm gonna tap the sides of it. And I'm gonna try to get try to get bubbles to rise to the surface. And you'll see the bubbles that are on the surface of the plaster as I'm doing that. And that's going to keep your voids down. That's going to keep it so that it's more of a solid block. You would also do the same thing if you were casting an object. Okay, so there's that. We're going to put that aside for now. The next thing I want to show you guys is how to use plaster gauze. So some of you guys are going to get plaster gauze. Here's the stuff. You're gonna want to have a sacrificial pair of scissors or a sacrificial X-Acto blade. I say sacrificial because when you cut this stuff with anything bladed, it's going to dull the bladed thing pretty quickly, so they're not gonna be useful for anything else. So I can use this stuff and put it around an object to get a casting of the shape of the object. Now this is kind of a rough object, so I'm going to have to be careful about how I wrap it so that I can actually remove this. It will solidify over it later, so I can even cut it if I wanted to help make it easier to get off. And another thing to consider whenever you're casting an object, whether it be with plaster gauze or with wet plaster in its liquid form, is that you're gonna need to put a mold release on that object in order to be able to remove the object from the mold later. So a basic mold release is this stuff here, petroleum jelly. We're gonna go ahead and use that. We're gonna get a brush and we're just gonna brush the surface of this with it. Pretty liberally. Now the plaster gauze, I can possibly get it stuck on this object if I'm not careful about how I wrap it. but also the plaster gauze isn't necessarily going to be super finely wrapped around the object itself, just because of the nature of the sort of flexibility sort of tendencies of the material. It's not super flexible. So, but nonetheless, the other thing is that I'm going to hit up the area here that I'm going to be doing this in as well, because I'm going to be having some of the plaster gauze touch the bench top. So I want to make sure that I can get it off of here without it sticking. So mold release on everything. Okay, then we're going to get another bucket and some water. Now this time we're using it for a little different reason. We're going to be soaking pieces of plaster gauze in it. So we're going to start to take some cuttings, and we're going to take our plaster gauze, pop it in there, and wipe off some of the excess water by hand. Then bring it over to your object and mummify it. Wrap around. Now with a single layer like this, you'll get a rigid shell off of it, but it might not be super strong. So you could do a second layer, which I'm going to go ahead and do. This one is going to be a shorter layer. Dunk. Squish out the excess and wrap it again. And you can continue this process more depending on how strong you need that to be. So, all right, let's see how our plaster turned out. So here's our plaster bucket. We let this cure for maybe an hour and should be good to go. Now, right now, we cast it in a smaller bucket with sloping sides, and it's a smooth surface on the interior, so it should have cast just fine, meaning it shouldn't be too hard to take out of this bucket. So we're gonna try to see how that goes. So with a bucket of plaster, you should be able to just take it, flip it upside down, press on the bottom of the bucket. Sometimes a press isn't enough. You could also, if it's a plastic bucket, it's flexible, so you can just kind of squish it a little bit, press, and it comes out. And that's what you end up with. So we're gonna go ahead and check on our rigid shell casting that we did with the plaster gauze. One thing that we can notice right away is that it seems to have cured, did pretty well. We did our sealing with our petroleum jelly and it held up pretty well. And now we've got this thing wrapped around this rock. Now, because of the shape of this object, we ended up with what are called undercuts. An undercut is basically any point where the form of the object is wider somewhere up along the form rather than at the base. So the widest part of something that you put in a mold should be the base, and then it should get narrower after that. Because anything that's wider is going to cause the mold to physically lock over your object. So we can fix this, not hard to fix at all. So what you do is you get an X-Acto and you have to kind of figure out where that undercut is. So based on what I'm seeing, it looks like it's over here. And you can cut the back of the mold. And you score it a few times until you get through so you can open it. And once you get past the undercut, you should be able to split the mold and pull this off. We'll see if it's going to cooperate. Almost. Okay. Feels like it's coming out. Okay, and there we have it. So the mold is out, and that means that you've got your rigid shell, which in and of itself could be your object, but also you've got the interior space here, which you can cast in. So I wouldn't necessarily do it with plaster. What you could do is you could repair this with another piece of plaster gauze so that you have a complete enclosed object again. And then you can pour another material in here, whether you're casting with a plastic or a rubber or something like that. Rubber would be particularly good in a mold like this because it would be flexible and easy to take out of the mold. So the reason why we used specifically a rock like this is because this is kind of like your not ideal crafting or casting material. This is literally the type of thing that you want to avoid when you are doing a rigid shell casting or taking a mold of an object, because this object is extremely rough and extremely porous, and as a result of that, it's going to be quite difficult to remove it from the mold. As you saw, it was a good bit of work to get that out of there. And I got it to work, mainly because I used a lot of mold release. Do not skimp on the mold release. And the other thing is that when I wrapped it, I kept the plaster gauze kind of loose around the form. I didn't really squish it onto the form, because you can take a very, very fine casting with plaster gauze. It will, it will take a pretty fine, high fidelity casting of most materials. But if it gets stuck, then it's really no good. It's just a very tight wrapping. So when you're choosing an object to encase in plaster gauze, you have to make sure that it is something that you can actually do that to without trapping it in the gauze.